In 1873, a cattle drover named Cal Reeves walked into a trading post in Dodge City with three things hidden on his body that modern law enforcement would classify as felonies. He wasn't an outlaw. He wasn't a gunfighter. He was a working man who understood one thing about the American frontier that we've almost completely forgotten. The world was dangerous, and a man who wasn't prepared for that danger was a man who didn't come home. What he carried wasn't unusual. It was ordinary. It was what every man around him carried, what their fathers had carried, and what their grandfathers had carried before the country even had a name. The difference between Carl Reeves and a criminal wasn't what was in his pockets. It was what era he lived in. Number 14 on this list was standard equipment for frontier lawmen, issued by the government, carried on duty, considered essential, until the same government decided civilians couldn't be trusted with it. And number 3 was sold openly at general stores across the frontier for less than $1, no questions asked, sitting right next to the tobacco and the hardtack. Before we start, subscribe, because once you understand what your great-grandfather considered everyday carry, you'll never look at a museum display case the same way again. Let's count them down. Number 25, the weighted poker chip. Walk into any frontier saloon between 1850 and 1900, and you'd find men with chips in their pockets that had nothing to do with gambling. Experienced card players and men who worked the rougher end of the river trade carried poker chips that had been quietly modified. A small cavity drilled into the clay or bone composite, filled with lead shot, resealed flush with the surface. In the palm, a stack of 3 or 4 of these weighed almost nothing. In a closed fist, they gave the same advantage as weighted knuckles, concentrating force without the profile of brass knuckles that frontier sheriffs knew to look for. A man could sit at a card table, palm a small stack, and be ready for whatever the next hand brought, whether that was a winning pot or a dispute over one. The beauty of the weighted chip was deniability. Every man at the table had chips. No one could prove yours were different without a scale, and frontier sheriffs had better things to do than weigh gambling tokens. This was the original concealed carry that didn't look like concealed carry, a weapon hiding inside the most ordinary object in the room. Number 24, the Bowie knife. Jim Bowie didn't invent the knife that carries his name. He just made it famous. At the Sandbar fight of 1827, where he survived being shot, stabbed, and clubbed before killing a man with a blade that witnesses described as something between a hunting knife and a short sword. After that fight, every blacksmith in the South and West had customers asking for the same design. The Bowie knife was a beast. Blade length ran anywhere from 9 inches to over a foot, thick-spined, clip-pointed, with a crossguard that caught other blades, and a balance that felt like an extension of the arm. Men carried Bowie knives openly on the belt, sheathed in tooled leather. In Texas and Louisiana, the Bowie was the gentleman's sidearm before the revolver became reliable. Lawyers carried them. Ministers carried them on the road between parishes. Then the legislatures came. Mississippi banned Bowie knives in 1837. Alabama followed. Georgia, Tennessee, and Virginia all passed restrictions before the Civil War, making the Bowie one of the earliest targets of American weapons legislation. Not because criminals carried it, because everybody did. The knife that came off the belt went into the boot, and the frontier continued on. Number 23, the sword cane. a gentleman's walking stick, polished hardwood, brass ferrule, carved knob, concealing inside its hollow shaft a blade of 12 to 24 inches, released by a twist of the handle that looked, to any observer, like a man adjusting his grip. The sword cane was a civilization weapon, the tool of merchants, lawyers, bankers, and the class of professional gamblers who cultivated a refined image as part of their trade. A man with a sword cane looked like he didn't need a weapon. That was always the point. Sears, Roebuck, and Company sold them through their mail-order catalog into the early 1900s, listed alongside farm equipment with no more ceremony than a plow attachment. Any man in America with a catalog and $2 could own one. When concealed weapons laws expanded, courts spent decades arguing about whether a sword cane was a cane or a blade. Meanwhile, the men who carried them kept walking. Number 22. The pepperbox pistol. Before the Colt revolver dominated, the most common multi-shot firearm in America was the pepperbox, a cluster of 4 to 6 barrels rotating around a central axis. Pull the trigger, the next barrel rotates forward. No complicated cylinder mechanism, just rotating iron, percussion caps, and 5 more chances if the first one didn't finish it. The pepperbox was notorious for 2 things. First, it was wildly inaccurate. The heavy trigger pull required to rotate the barrels threw the aim off in ways experienced shooters compensated for and beginners paid for. Second, it occasionally fired all barrels simultaneously, a malfunction called a chain fire that turned the shooter's hand into a hazard zone. None of this stopped them from selling by the tens of thousands. Gamblers loved them. Merchants kept them under counters. Mark Twain described the pepperbox in Roughing It as a cheerful weapon, the amusement of the multitude. The men who carried them seriously were not laughing. Number 21. The Apache pistol. This sounds like something from a fever dream, but it was real. Manufactured in quantity and specifically designed to be the most dangerous object that fit inside a closed hand. The Apache pistol was a combination weapon produced in France and Belgium and imported into America in significant numbers between the 1870s and early 1900s. It combined 3 elements in a single folding device: a small pinfire revolver, a knuckle duster grip with finger holes cast directly into the frame, and a fold-out blade of 3 to 4 inches. The whole package folded into something roughly the size of a large pocket watch. Unfolded, it was simultaneously a firearm, brass knuckles, and a knife. A man in a close-quarters confrontation could shoot, punch, and cut without changing weapons. The Apache was designed for environments where fights happened at arm's length and ended in seconds. American law enforcement encountered them frequently in cities with large immigrant populations and in frontier towns where the men who built railroads brought their own ideas about what a man should carry. The weapon was banned repeatedly. It kept appearing anyway. Number 20. The bludgeon cane. Not a sword cane, not a walking stick that happened to be heavy. The bludgeon cane was built from the beginning for exactly one purpose, with no pretense of being anything else to anyone who knew what they were looking at. American craftsmen in the 1800s made bludgeon canes from the densest available hardwoods: Osage orange, ironwood, black locust. Woods so heavy they sank in water, and so hard they rang like metal when struck against stone. The head was carved into a bulbous knob, sometimes lead inlaid, sometimes the natural swelling of a root ball selected specifically because it was already weighted by nature. Frontier lawmen carried them when they didn't want the escalation a drawn firearm produced. Stagecoach guards used them for crowd control at depots. Mountain men who lived months from the nearest gun shop found them more reliable than any mechanism that could rust, freeze, or misfire. The bludgeon cane was never banned because it was never officially classified as anything other than a walking stick, a classification that was legally accurate and practically absurd in equal measure. Number 19. The Derringer. Henry Derringer built his first pocket pistol in Philadelphia in the 1820s. By the 1860s, the design had been copied by dozens of manufacturers, and the Derringer had become the defining concealed carry weapon of the frontier era. It was small. That was the point. A single or double-shot pistol chambered in a caliber that wouldn't win a fight at distance, but would end one at arm's length. It fit into a vest pocket, a boot top, or a gambler's sleeve holster with equal ease. Not a fighting weapon, a last resort weapon. Something to produce when the situation had already gone wrong, and the only remaining question was who would walk away. John Wilkes Booth carried a .44 caliber single-shot Derringer on April 14th, 1865. That night gave the Derringer a reputation it spent decades trying to outlive. Pawn shops in mountain towns kept them in glass cases next to pocket watches and wedding rings, priced between $5 and $15, available to any man with the cash. No license, no waiting period, no paperwork beyond the transaction itself. Number 18. The Slungshot. A lead ball wrapped in braided rawhide on a short, flexible handle. The most commonly banned weapon in 19th century American legal history, outlawed in more states than brass knuckles, blackjacks, and switchblades combined. The reason was simple. It worked, and it required nothing to make. Smooth river stones from any creek bed, wrapped in rawhide cut from any barn, braided with the same skill that went into horse tack. A man who could braid a rein could make a slungshot in an afternoon. The flexible handle absorbed the recoil on the wielder's wrist while multiplying velocity at the striking end, concentrating the weight of a lead ball into an impact area smaller than a silver dollar. State after state banned them through the mid to late 1800s. The bans produced almost no reduction in use because production was so simple, enforcement was effectively impossible. Every ban on the slungshot was a law against a concept, and concepts don't respond to legislation. Grandfathers who kept them in coat pockets rarely mentioned them. The slungshot spoke for itself on the occasions when it spoke at all. Number 17. The push dagger. The push dagger is one of the most mechanically efficient close-quarters weapons ever designed. The handle crosses the palm horizontally. The blade extends forward between the middle and ring fingers. Every ounce of a forward punch drives that point into the target rather than dissipating across the surface of a fist. The design found its American chapter with riverboat gamblers and Mississippi steamboat culture in the mid-1800s. Men who worked or traveled the river needed something compact, concealable, and effective in cramped interior spaces, narrow corridors, tiny cabins, gambling rooms, where raising an arm for a full swing meant hitting the ceiling or a bystander. The push dagger was 3 inches long, fit in a watch pocket, required no swing, no backlash, no space. Tennessee outlawed it before 1880. Other states followed. The design was so simple, a blade, a crosspiece, a grip, that no ban eliminated it. any blacksmith with scrap iron and an afternoon could make a functional one. The law made them illegal. It didn't make them disappear. Number 16. The knuckle duster, 4 finger holes cast from brass, iron, or carved from hardwood, by craftsmen who understood a fundamental truth about human biology. The hand is strong, but the bones inside it are fragile. And anything that protects those bones while concentrating force multiplies what a man can deliver without destroying himself in the process. On the frontier, blacksmiths forged custom sets fitted to individual hands, some with pointed studs, others smooth and rounded for courthouse towns where a man might need to explain himself the next morning. The earliest bands came in the 1880s, driven by the same moral reform movements targeting alcohol and gambling. The effect on actual possession was approximately zero. Pawnshops kept them in cigar boxes under the counter. Flea market vendors knew which pocket to reach into. The knuckle duster was the weapon that refused to die, no matter how many laws were written against it, because the men who owned one didn't consider it a crime. They considered it common sense. Number 15. The hideout revolver. The full-size Colt single-action army was the gun that won the West. Or so the mythology insists. What the mythology leaves out is that most working men of the frontier era found it too large, too conspicuous, and too slow to draw in the close quarters situations where they actually needed a firearm. The hideout revolver filled that gap. Smaller caliber, shorter barrel, designed to live in places a full-sized revolver couldn't reach. Coat pockets, vest pockets, shoulder holsters under suit jackets, specially designed pockets sewn into coat linings by tailors who understood what their customers actually carried. Remington, Smith & Wesson and Colt all produced pocket revolvers for this market. Wells Fargo messengers carried them as backup to their shotguns. Gamblers carried them as backup to their main pistols. Women heading west on wagon trains carried them as their primary because the Derringer's one shot felt like too little and the full-sized revolver felt like too much weight. When concealed, carry laws tightened through the late 1800s. The hideout revolver was one of the first casualties. Too small to be obviously necessary, too concealable to survive the suspicion that came with concealment. Number 14. The blackjack. A flat piece of leather sewn around a lead weight, small enough to disappear in a coat pocket, heavy enough to end a confrontation with a single swing. The blackjack was a weapon of enclosed spaces. Mining camp security offices, railroad depot waiting rooms, the back rooms of saloons where disputes were settled away from witnesses. The professional grade was made by saddle makers who understood load distribution. The lead weight molded to fill the leather pocket perfectly, stitched with waxed thread that wouldn't give under impact. A clean strike concentrated enormous energy into a small area, producing results that ranged from stunning to permanent depending on location and force. Frontier law enforcement adopted the blackjack early. County sheriffs issued them to deputies working mining camps, where firearms meant constant escalation risk. The logic was straightforward. A blackjack could stop a man without necessarily killing him, which kept paperwork manageable. The same weapon was simultaneously the favored tool of the men those deputies were trying to control. Bans came state by state through the middle of the 20th century. Departments stopped issuing them. Deputies who had carried them for 20 years quietly put them in desk drawers. The blackjack didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because it worked too well, and that was eventually considered the problem. Number 13. The Bowie pistol. If the Bowie knife was the defining blade of the frontier, the Bowie pistol was its logical evolution, a firearm with a blade attached, designed for the moment when the gun was empty and the fight wasn't over. Several American manufacturers in the mid-1800s produced pistols with a secondary blade attached to the barrel or frame, folded flat against the gun for normal use, deployable in a second by a catch or hinge. The concept addressed a real problem in an era of single-shot pistols. The first shot was decisive if it worked and catastrophic if it didn't, and reloading in a fight was a fantasy that rarely survived contact with reality. The Bowie pistol gave a man who had fired his shot something to do with his empty gun besides throw it. They were banned aggressively and early, often lumped into legislation targeting combination weapons specifically because the combination was seen as evidence of premeditated violence. Surviving examples appear occasionally in estate sales, their combination of firearm and blade still striking more than a century after manufacture. Practical, ingenious, and almost completely forgotten. Number 12. The hatpin. This entry belongs to the grandmothers. Women who crossed the frontier with their families, ran boarding houses, rode stages and trains alone through country, where personal safety depended entirely on personal preparation. In an era when women's hats were secured by steel pins of 8 to 12 inches, every woman in America carried a concealed weapon, whether the law recognized it or not. A hatpin was hardened surgical steel, long enough to reach vital structures from a hand's length away. Women who traveled alone on frontier roads learned to grip one defensively, the ornamented head in the palm, the point forward. The hatpin panics of the 1880s and 1890s produced actual legislation in several American cities. Ordinances limiting pin length. Women fought back through newspapers, arguing that the pin was fashion, not armament, and that the legislation would leave them defenseless. When hat fashions changed in the early 20th century, the hatpin disappeared not through legislation, but through the millinery industry. One of the most effective self-defense tools in American women's history was retired by a change in fashion, not a change in law. Number 11. The balisong. The butterfly knife arrived in America in the hands of Filipino immigrants who came to work the West Coast fishing and farming industries in the late 1800s. In the Philippines, the balisong was a utility knife, a craft tool, and a weapon in a blade tradition that treated the knife as an extension of the hand rather than an object picked up when needed. The opening action, two handles rotating around a central blade, snapping together with a click, was simultaneously a manipulation skill and, in practiced hands, one of the fastest deployments of any folding blade. American men who encountered Filipino workers in the California canneries and Hawaiian sugar fields watched the knife handling with admiration and unease in equal measure. It was eventually banned in most jurisdictions, not because of any particular crime wave, but because the manipulation skill looked threatening to people who didn't understand it. A man sitting quietly opening and closing a knife by rotating the handles was processing a traditional skill. To a legislator's eye, he was practicing for violence. The balisong ban made working-class men who had carried the same knife since boyhood into criminals without a single act of violence to justify the classification. Number 10. The chain flail. The original medieval weapon sounds like it belongs in a different century. What belongs in the frontier story is the improvised version that appeared wherever men who worked with chains, miners, loggers, teamsters, railroad builders, needed a weapon and had materials immediately at hand. A section of logging chain 12 to 18 inches long, folded once and gripped at the fold, became a flail capable of producing force that no bare hand could match. Railroad men who handled trace chains and rigging all day developed an intuitive understanding of how to use that weight. The physics of a heavy chain are not subtle. These improvised weapons were never manufactured, never sold, never regulated specifically because they were never formally recognized as weapons. They were chains. Every mine, every logging camp, every railroad yard had hundreds of them. What couldn't be banned couldn't be confiscated. The chain weapon survived not because it was hidden, but because it was everywhere, all the time, doing ordinary work until the moment it was needed for something else. Number 9. The sleeve gun. In the 1860s and 1870s, American gunsmiths developed a mechanism that sounds like it belongs in a dime novel, but was commercially produced and seriously purchased. A spring-loaded sleeve holster that could snap a small pistol from inside a coat sleeve into the firing hand in under a second, triggered by a flick of the wrist. The mechanism worked on the same principle as a sleeve-mounted card holder used by gambling cheats. A spring-loaded track on the forearm, released by a muscle movement that looked to any observer like a man adjusting his cuff. In a sleeve gun, the object was a small single or double-shot pistol, positioned with the barrel forward, accessible the moment it hit the palm. Professional gamblers were the primary market. A man who went for a visible holster telegraphed his intentions across the room. A man whose gun appeared in his hand as if from nowhere had a decisive advantage in the moments that followed. No specific legislation targeted the sleeve gun mechanism itself. The pistols that rode in them were regulated as pistols. The spring tracks were hardware, and the combination sat in a legal gap that the law hadn't yet thought to close. Number 8. The tomahawk. The frontier-era tomahawk was not purely a weapon and not purely a tool. It was the hybrid object that a hybrid world produced. Something that chopped wood in the morning and served a different purpose in the evening, with no modification required and no apology offered for the versatility. The belt axe, as working versions were often called, was carried by hunters, trappers, soldiers, and settlers throughout the frontier period. The blade was functional for woodwork, notching, splitting, limbing. The weighted pole opposite the blade served as a hammer. The whole thing balanced in the hand in a way that made it fast and controllable. The tomahawk was also throwable at distances up to 30 feet by men who practiced the skill, more men than modern imagination typically credits. No government successfully restricted tomahawk carry on the frontier because no government had sufficient presence to enforce such a restriction even if it had tried. The belt axe went where its owner went, did what its owner needed, and earned a kind of legal immunity through sheer necessity. Number 7. The Lemat revolver. Most revolvers of the Civil War era held 6 shots. The Lemat held 9, plus 1. The central cylinder carried 9.4 2-caliber rounds. Beneath that cylinder, a second, shorter barrel was chambered for a 16-gauge shotgun shell, fired by switching the hammer nose with a thumb press. 10 shots from a single handgun, one of which was a shotgun. In 1856, Jean-Alexandre Lemat designed it in New Orleans. The Confederate Army adopted it for officers. General Beauregard carried one. J.E.B. Stuart carried one. The men who carried them reported that the shotgun barrel, deployed against cavalry at close range, produced results that 9 rifle-caliber rounds sometimes didn't. After the war, Surplus LeMat moved west with the migration of veterans looking for new starts. When handgun regulations tightened in the early 20th century, the LeMat was already a historical artifact. But the men who carried them through the frontier decades were carrying something that modern shooters look at as science fiction. A 10-shot combination handgun and shotgun built before the Civil War ended. Number 6. The trench knife, frontier precursor. Before the trench knife became the defining close-quarters weapon of the First World War, American craftsmen had been working on the concept for decades. A short blade married to a knuckle guard in a single integrated weapon that functioned as both a cutting tool and a striking tool without transition. Civil War soldiers on both sides improvised combination weapons that added a knuckle guard to a fighting knife or attached a blade to brass knuckles. The improvised versions were rough. Refined manufactured versions followed through the 1870s and 1880s, marketed to hunters and frontiersmen. The combination weapon logic was straightforward. In a close fight that escalated from fists, a man who was already gripping a knuckle guard didn't need to reach for something new. The blade was already there. Several states banned combination weapons specifically, targeting the knuckle and blade design as evidence of premeditated violence. The bans accelerated after veterans brought refined versions home from the First World War. Today, these weapons appear in military history museums. In their era, they were owned by men who had thought carefully about what a fight actually felt like and designed their carry accordingly. Number 5. The volcanic pistol. Before the Winchester rifle defined American firearms history, the company that would become Winchester made something stranger. The volcanic pistol, a lever-action repeating handgun that fired self-contained projectiles that were essentially the direct ancestors of the modern cartridge. The volcanic used a lever below the barrel to cycle a tubular magazine holding up to 10 rounds. A hollow base bullet with the propellant charge contained inside the bullet itself rather than in a separate case. Pull the lever, load the next round, cock the hammer, fire. Repeat at a speed that no revolver of the era could match. The volcanic was never a commercial success. The proprietary ammunition was weak, the mechanism complex, the price high. But the men who owned them understood they were holding an idea rather than just a gun. The idea that a firearm didn't have to be limited by how many rounds a man could load before the fight started. That idea survived the volcanic's failure and found its proper expression in the lever-action rifles that followed. The men who carried volcanic pistols were carrying the prototype of the modern repeating firearm in their coat pockets. Number 4. The Arkansas toothpick. The name was ironic. The Arkansas toothpick was a double-edged dagger with a blade between 7 and 12 inches. Slim, needle-pointed, built not for the broad frontier violence the Bowie knife was designed for, but for concealment. It rode in a boot, inside a coat, in a sheath sewn into the lining of a vest. Lawyers carried them. Gamblers carried them. The class of men who wore good suits and moved through frontier society's more refined spaces carried them as an acknowledgement that good suits did not guarantee good company. Several states banned double-edged, concealed blades before the Civil War, making the Arkansas toothpick one of the earliest specifically targeted weapons in American legal history. The bans produced the same result that frontier weapon bans consistently produced. The men who wanted to carry them continued to carry them in locations that required more imagination to search. Estate sales in the Arkansas and Tennessee hills produced them well into the 20th century, wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of dresser drawers, tucked into the toes of old boots. The grandfathers who put them there didn't talk about why. The knife itself was explanation enough. Number 3. The baling hook, a curved steel hook on a wooden handle designed for grabbing and moving hay bales. Every farm, every feed store, every livery stable, every barn from Missouri to California had at least one hanging on a nail. Sold at general stores across the frontier for less than $1, right next to the tobacco and the hardtack, just as we said at the start. No license, no background check, no suspicion attached to the purchase. It was a farm tool. It was also a weapon that required no modification, fit the hand as naturally as a handshake, and was sharp and curved and heavy in all the places that mattered. In close quarters, the narrow aisle of a stable, the confined space of a bunkhouse, the back of a supply wagon, the baling hook reached angles a straight blade couldn't, around a raised arm, past a guard, into spaces a man trying to protect himself hadn't thought to protect. Nobody questioned a man with a baling hook near a barn. The question only arose when the barn was somewhere else. No law specifically targeted it because no law could argue with a straight face that a hay tool was a weapon, even when everyone in the room understood perfectly well what it could do. Number 2. The straight razor. Every man shaved. Every man who shaved before the safety razor era owned a straight razor. And every man on the frontier who owned one carried, in his daily grooming kit, 4 inches of surgical steel honed to an edge that could split a human hair lengthwise. The straight razor required no modification to be lethal. It required no concealment. It was a grooming tool as ordinary as a comb, as respectable as a clean collar. It required no justification for its presence in a pocket or travel kit. It was civilization in metal form, the instrument that separated the shaved man from the unshaved, the settled from the drifting. In mining camps, cattle towns, and railroad depots, straight razors settled disputes that fists couldn't finish, and that firearms escalated past the point of manageability. A razor fight was fast, quiet, and confined. It didn't echo through a building, it didn't require reloading, and it didn't bring a deputy running from across the street. The straight razor was never banned, because banning it would have meant banning shaving. When safety razors took over in the early 20th century, the most common weapon of the frontier era became a collector's item. The men who had carried them didn't notice the transition from tool to artifact. They were already gone. Number 1. The pocket knife. Your great-grandfather gave you not the Arkansas toothpick, not the Bowie, not the switchblade or any of the more dramatic entries on this list. The simple 2-blade jackknife with the bone or staghorn handle. The one he pressed into your palm when you were 7 or 8 years old. The one he told you to keep sharp and never pointed anything you weren't willing to damage. The one he carried every single day of his adult life, without thinking about it once. That knife wasn't about self-defense. It wasn't about the frontier or violence or any of the other things this list has spent its length discussing. It was about identity. It said you were old enough to be trusted, old enough to whittle, to cut rope, to open feed sacks, old enough to understand that a tool in your hands was only as dangerous as your intentions, and that your intentions, he expected, were sound. Every man on the frontier carried one. Every boy dreamed of the day he would receive his, not because he wanted a weapon, but because he understood that a pocket knife was the first adult thing a man owned. The first thing that was entirely his responsibility, that could hurt him if he was careless and help him if he wasn't. That required judgment rather than just physical strength to use properly. When zero-tolerance policies arrived in schools in the 1990s, when blade-length laws tightened in cities, when the pocket knife that had ridden in every working man's pocket for a century became a matter for law enforcement, what was lost wasn't a weapon. It was a ritual, a ceremony of trust between a man who understood how the world worked and a child who was ready to start learning. The pocket knife sits at number one, not because it was the most dangerous thing your great-grandfather carried, but because it was the most honest. A tool, a responsibility, a piece of steel that connected a boy to every man who had come before him, all the way back to the first man who picked up a sharp stone and understood that the world was easier with it than without it. If you still have his knife, if it's sitting in a dresser drawer somewhere, blade dull, handle worn smooth by a hand that no longer holds anything, take it out, sharpen it, carry it if your state still allows it. He'd want you to. That is the list. 25 things your great-grandfather carried without a second thought, most of which would require a lawyer to explain today. The American frontier made men practical in ways that modern life has almost completely forgotten. Practical about danger, practical about tools, practical about the narrow line between the two. These weren't criminals. They were working men who understood something that we've spent a century and a half trying to legislate away, that a prepared man is a safer man, and that the object in his pocket was only ever as dangerous as the world that made him feel he needed it. If your great-grandfather carried something we missed, put it in the comments. And if you've got his old jackknife in that dresser drawer, you already know everything this list was trying to say.